Hello, everyone, and welcome to Creature Comfort, a spin-off series of the Straight Chilling podcast. On this show, we love to explore the fringes of horror and all things horror adjacent. I'm your host, Soju, and tonight we're going to be talking about The Passion of the Christ from 2004. Now, I have wanted to cover this film for a little while now because it has always lived in my mind as a particularly brutal film ever since the first time I saw it when it was out in theaters in 2004. And even if you've never seen this film before, I feel like you probably know that this has some, of course, really strong ties to Christianity. It is about the death of Jesus when he is kind of tortured and then crucified. And because of that, I definitely wanted to be very considerate of its ties to Christianity. A lot of people love this film because of their faith, and I completely understand that. I also wanted to look at it as a film because this film does have a lot of darker elements. It's got the devil. It's got demons, it's got some jump scares, and even, suicide. It shows the torture of a man that many people love in their hearts around the world because of their faith. And so, yeah, I thought it would be a very interesting film to cover just as a film and with its ties to Christianity. But before we get too far into that, let's go ahead and meet our guest for tonight. And joining me tonight for her second time on Creature Comforts from the Light and Shadow podcast, welcome, Nichole.
Hey, Justin, thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining me for this special episode that I'm super nervous about and glad that you're going to be joining me on this journey. Thank you so much.
Yes, it's going to be great.
Yeah. So, of course, to start things off, please let everyone know where they can find your very special and amazing work and where they can listen to it, where they can find you, contact you, anything like that.
So I do Light and Shadow, a horror podcast. You can find me on your favorite podcatchers. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook at Light and Shadow Pod. And this is a fun episode for me to guest on, especially because right now I am doing a religion and horror series. I've been doing that for about a year. And it's been a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun. So come along if that sounds like something you're interested in.
Yeah, and I gotta say, I mean, I've listened to your show for a long time now, and I always enjoyed it. But it has been an interesting journey over the past year of had this different guests that you have on. They always talk about their religious backgrounds, and then these different films exploring religion and horror and stuff like that. It's been great stuff, and I've really enjoyed listening to it over the past year. So great stuff.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, and of course, you are the first person I thought of to consider this. I had to ask everybody's permission. Do you think it's okay that I do this? Nichole's going to join me. I think everybody trusted a lot more that okay, Nichole's involved. Okay, we got this.
I'm glad that I could, get the stamp of approval for you.
Yes, of course. So we can go ahead and get into a little bit. So tonight, again, we are talking about The Passion of the Christ. This is a film from 2004 that depicts the final 12 hours in the life of Jesus of Nazareth on the day of his crucifixion in Jerusalem. It was directed by Mel Gibson, starring Jim Caviezel, Monica Bellucci, some other folks. And, this was a big deal back in the day in 2004. And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit more. But to kind of give some context to that and to kind of our perception of this movie a little bit, I was wondering if Nichole, we could do something that you do on your show these days and kind of would you be kind enough to share your religious background with us to give us some context for this?
Sure. So I am a typical Christian kid, was raised in church. I do not remember a time when my family did not go to church. Um, and I grew up in pretty much small churches, and I grew up Pentecostal. So I grew up in the Assembly of God denomination. And so for those who may not know, it's a real charismatic denomination. So speaking in tongues, people like laying on hands. You go up to the altar to pray. Sometimes people are running around the church. It's very vocal. It's very expressive worship. And I was in that denomination until I was 18. My parents are still very devoted Christians, both in and out of church. But when I was 18, we all kind of were sort of over some of the just politics and stuff in that denomination. And so I went to a Nazarene church and went there for a few years. So ever since we left that denomination at 18, like I've gone to Methodist, I've gone to non-denominational, have kind of hopped around to different places and done different things. I played in a worship band at several different churches. So I've always liked art. I've always been into music. So like faith and art has kind of always overlapped for me in that way. And even when I was a kid, I mean, I loved horror movies. My mom loves scary stuff. And so even though I was in this super evangelical, like fundamental church, I was still into the spooky stuff,
Cool.
But as an adult, I've been on, a faith journey for almost 4 decades. And I've never left the faith, but it's changed quite a bit from when I was in those Pentecostal services. And now I go to just a house church. Like I don't even go to a regular church. It's just a small gathering of 20 to 30 people. And so my life now as a Christian looks way different than it did when I was young. And, I don't want to even call it like religious trauma. But I had to sort through a lot of stuff and really decide for myself, like, okay, what do I actually believe? And what am I going to sort of discard? Which a lot of people who have been in the faith for many decades have had to do that. So like I said, I'm in a very different place now than I was when I grew up, but still consider myself a practicing Christian.
Religious baggage, maybe we could say.
Baggage is accurate.
I'd do a little spring cleaning on that, right? Yeah.
That is
Well,
perfect. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, I like you. Similarly grew up in a church. Don't remember a time, from the time I was born that my family wasn't religious. They've always been religious. So I grew up in that. But on the kind of the opposite end of you, in a way, I grew up in a Southern non-denominational church that was similar to Baptist, but somehow even more conservative, to the point where like we didn't even have music in our church. So
Ooh.
so very like a cappella, very just none of the lively stuff going on. And so yeah, like you, I attended there for the most part on the regular until I was like 18. At the time too, I was kind of doing this double thing where I was dating somebody who went to a Baptist church. And so at times I was literally going to like 2 churches, like on a Wednesday night or something like that. And that was even thing like, oh my God, there's a worship band. Whoa, like, it's so funny to reflect on now in hindsight. But I wasn't necessarily into horror at the time. Dabbled, a little bit, but I didn't really have anybody strong in my life kind of pushing that. So that is even something I came to later, because once I hit 18, I stopped attending church, mostly just kind of quit cold turkey. There was a couple times where I would go like to some small meetings and like stuff like that, and it's like small discussion groups, but never any kind of like worship again, to the point where I went last year with my family to a New Year's Eve service, and just to spend family time. And felt really uncomfortable there, to be honest. It was really not a comfortable space for me, and decided not to go this year. They're like, "Oh, we're going to Christmas Eve service. You want to go?" I was like, nah, I don't think I'm gonna go this year. So yeah, similar paths, different destinations as of now, but yeah. So
Yeah.
grew up with it a lot though.
So similarly, I not this past Easter, but the Easter before, I ended up going with my family like to my childhood church.
Wow.
And I knew I was like I had to like prepare myself for it. But same, I was uncomfortable and like my family sits in like the second row.
Oh
So
yeah.
I'm like on the second row and I was just like endlessly irritated. Like
Oh
the whole
no.
service, I'm like, "Oh, you guys haven't changed since I left here 20 years ago," you know? So it was, yeah, it was uncomfortable, but I also think it was a good, like growth moment for me to kind of like go back and sort of have to just like get over it, you know, and move on. But yeah, I
Yeah.
feel that.
It's like going back to your old elementary school or something. You're like, it smells exactly the same. Like somehow elementary schools all smell the same. But yeah, churches in the same way just kind of somehow never change, it seems like.
Yeah.
But yeah, well, thank you for sharing that with me. And we can then transition into this question I have for you to kind of kick us off of what does this movie mean to you then with that kind of background? And then would you recommend people check it out?
So this movie been a pretty important movie to me. I remember when it came out, just the whirlwind around it. And in general, I remember it being really important to evangelicals, which I am really, really critical of Christian art.
Hmm.
Um, Now, I was like way into the Christian music scene when I was a teenager, and that was awesome. Like, that was an awesome culture to be a part of. But Christian movies have always sucked. You know,
Hmm.
I've just always been highly critical of them, even as a kid, like, even as a young, like, teenager. So when I saw that this movie was going to be like taken seriously, I was really excited for it because of that. And because I was like deep in evangelical culture. So we were all just hyped for it.
Hmm.
And at the time, it did not disappoint. And then in the times I revisited it, I think I've watched it 3 times and it's held up for me personally. I think just the fact that it's taken so seriously and they don't shy away from the difficult parts of the story. That
Hmm.
to me is very, very impactful. And so, like I told you before we started recording, I did not rewatch it for this episode because it's not a super just casual, easy movie for me to watch because it is so impactful and so serious. Um, and I know it pretty well. So, but yeah, so it's a pretty emotionally impactful movie for me. And as far as recommending it, it's hard kind of to say whether or not I would recommend it. Because I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to like horror fans. And I would only recommend it to like some Christians, I
Hmm.
guess. So it's kind of a weird, it's a hard, I feel like it's a hard one to recommend. You sort of have to be a certain audience. Although I do think it's a beautiful film and it's an artful film. So I think you can enjoy it even if you're just a layperson or whatever, but it is kind of a hard one to recommend. What about you?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and so I saw this once before, and it was when I it came out. So I was younger at the time, and as I have gotten into horror and started even doing this sideshow, it's one of the first ones I put on the list because even though I only saw it once, it lived in my memory as being one of the more brutal films one of the most brutal films probably I've ever watched from my memory. And as I got deeper and deeper into horror and saw more and more kind of like shocking things, it still kind of lived in that space of like, when I was much younger. And like I said before, which was kind of important, not really into horror at the time. I watched Passion of the Christ, and yeah, so that was super intense. And because it is so intense, it's one of those things where I don't think I generally could recommend it to people, especially, and something I want to discuss a lot more later on is not to religious people, because I do think that this film, while impactful in who it's targeted at, I think it could turn some non-religious folks away from any type of religion. Like I think it could drive them further away, or, plant them further in a non-religious space. And so because it deals with some really brutal things. And then so yeah, but like you said, it is artfully done. So for anyone coming from a Christian mindset, I would say, yeah, check this film out, because I think it is something that at least takes it seriously in its acting and in its craft, which is always something I respect. Anything that's done that respects the craft is always going to get a bump in my book. So yeah, in that way, I do agree with you. So yeah, so for religious folks, but maybe I remember even back in the day, because this is rated R, by the way, and
Mhm.
the churches were buying tickets for like 13-year-olds, and like, you need to see this. This is important. And it's like, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. Maybe you should wait until like, you're mature enough to handle this kind of stuff.
Yeah,
18
I
is
remember
fine, I
that
think.
being part of the conversation, even amongst, church folks about like, well, I feel like this is an important story, but it's going to be really rough. So, like, what's appropriate?
Yeah.
I remember those conversations.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mostly, yeah, agree with you on that. And so to kind of get into the discussion for this show, specifically looking at it through a horror background lens, actually, you know what? No, I would actually like to go ahead and drop the spoiler warning now. It's something I learned my lesson on the previous episode and forgot to change it in my outline. So we are first going to go ahead and drop the spoiler warning on this one.
Spoiler warning.
Okay, now with the spoiler warning dropped, we're going to get into the discussion first. That is the kind of core of this show, which is kind of looking at things, horror adjacent things, through a horror lens. So I have 3 questions for you. It's going to be our coulda, woulda, shoulda segment. The first question is, Nichole, what subgenre of horror could you put this film into?
Ooh, this is kind of hard.
Yeah.
Because I've heard people and read things where people put this into torture porn, and I do not agree with that categorization. I sort of have a problem with that subgenre label in general, but we won't go down that rabbit trail. Um, so I think really the only thing it fits into is my niche, which is religious horror.
Mm, okay. Yeah. So, yeah, just obviously due to the religious nature of it, that makes
Hmm.
sense. That is, at its core, it is a religious film. Now, this is a little bit different than, torture porn. I mean, kind of. I think they could be like lumped in, but I guess it's got at least a nicer name. I personally put extreme horror, which would be films that explore extreme physical and psychological torment experienced
Hmm.
by the characters, and kind of like pushing the boundaries of traditional horror things, and like aiming to evoke some kind of like strong emotional reaction from the audience, because I think it does do that. I think it explores all of those aspects. And maybe with our in a couple questions we'll get into some films that might kind of touch on that subgenre. But yeah, that's I think it fits. Maybe too. I don't know. Maybe an aspect of a body horror too, because of some of the brutality that we experience in this film. A lot of times,
Hmm.
body horror is a little bit maybe more fantastical, but it doesn't have to be. So yeah, I think somewhere in those, it could fit if you had to. But
I
yeah.
just thought too, because it's more of like a drama with like horrific elements,
Hmm.
you might be able to call this like elevated horror. Like
Yeah.
this, if this came out now, I could see this being like an A24 type movie. It
Yeah.
fits better with those movies than I think anything else.
Yeah, David Fincher does Passion of the
Hey,
Jesus.
you joke, but Darren Aronofsky's Noah,
Mm,
it's a weird movie that I
hmm.
happen to love. So I
Okay.
love it when an atheist filmmaker like gets into some like Bible stories. It's great.
Yeah, we need to discuss more of his films later, just off camera, because he's got. It seems like Noah is his one big religious film, but I actually think he's got a couple that might kind of
Hmm.
fly under the religious radar, maybe. But yeah.
Hmm.
Okay. Well, second question would be, what one element would you change in this film to make it more of a horror film?
There's all these questions were so hard for me. But I think the thing that really to me makes it like super hopeful and makes it more squarely a Christian film is that scene at the very end where we see Christ basically being resurrected, where like the
Mhm.
grave, like he comes out of the grave clothes and we like basically see him, we see the hole in his hand and everything.
Mhm.
That ending to me is what feels the most like Christian movie about this film.
Mm.
So I think if you just ended with his death and you didn't get to see his resurrection, I think that would change the tone of the whole movie.
That's a really good
Um,
point. Mm.
yeah, yeah, that would be the biggest turn for me personally.
So you think if it just ended with his death on the cross or when he's pulled down, that yeah, that's a really
Yeah.
good point. Yeah, that's a really good one. I put less sentimental music, and I guess kind of this is tough for a film like this, but we'll kind of get into this later. But I guess I would say like less reverence for Jesus as a character, because I think you always
Yeah.
have to dance that line when you're making a religious film of Jesus is God, but he's also a human. And sometimes you feel like people play it safer and lean into the aspect more of he's God, so he
Yeah.
has to.
And that's definitely the perspective of this film, you
Yes,
know.
yes, yeah. So I completely understand it, but like if I was gonna make it more, horror centric, then yeah, I would definitely take some of that out.
Hmm.
Just to I guess lean more into the brutality of it. I guess that's the softer side of the film. So,
Right.
but yeah. So okay. And the final question for the horror adjacent discussion is: if people like this movie, what horror film should they check out?
Okay, so before I give a horror movie recommendation, I have to give a regular movie recommendation because
Okay.
what you just said about not portraying Christ as God, there's a movie called The Last Temptation of Christ,
Yes.
and it is like a super controversial movie. Willem Dafoe is Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
and he is depicted like it gives you the life of Jesus, but there's it's not sure. It's not saying for sure that he is God. Like there's doubt in it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think though I watched it in like film school, like film class in college,
Mm-hmm.
which I think was kind of a brave choice of my professor. But I think ultimately the message of the movie is really redeeming and really beautiful, even though it's an uncomfortable, difficult watch because it is from that perspective of is he God? Is he just a man? We're not sure. You have to decide for yourself. So that one. But as far as um horror movies go, I think a super obvious one is The Exorcist. Because again, that's a movie that's difficult to watch. It deals with some really difficult subject matter, but I think it ultimately has some really beautiful things to say about faith. And then there's this really bizarre short segment in the anthology film Holidays.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So in Holidays, each segment is a different holiday and they go in chronological order. So when you get to the Easter segment, there is a creature that is an amalgamation of the Easter Bunny and Jesus, and he looks terrifying.
Yeah.
It is such a weird short movie, but I love it. Again, I personally gleaned a lot of really important good stuff out of it. I think a lot of people could find it really offensive. To me personally, again, it had some really potent things to say about faith and
Mhm.
specifically about being taught from a young age what certain things mean and how that's confusing when you're a child. So,
Yeah.
Last Temptation of Christ, The Exorcist, and the Easter segment of Holidays.
That's a great pull because I forgot about that. I remember when I watched that and I was like, what is this? But like you said, it does kind of have and kind of going to your point earlier about Christian art and things like that, of the commercialization of religious things,
Mhm.
where this is going to be released during the Easter season, preparing for Easter and everything like that. And then we do have this religious aspect of it, and then we have this other aspect of it. And yeah, that's a great segment that combines those kinds of things, or those ideas, makes you think about those ideas.
Mhm.
I did that creature is very disturbing.
Yeah. I wrote
Yeah.
a blog about it, about that segment. So folks, if you want to hear more about the Jesus bunny, please go check out my website.
Good pull. Good pull. So I always like list a couple just in case we double down. So I have some alternatives. We didn't. So I'll list a couple because I pulled from different aspects of this film, depending on, like what really piqued your interest about this film, then maybe you should check this out. So the first one, because again, as I said, this lived in my mind as such a brutal film, and another type of film that I respect a lot that is equally as brutal and also touches on some religious ideas, just not from a Christian standpoint necessarily, is Martyrs from 2008. Have you ever seen Martyrs?
Oh, I love Martyrs.
Yeah.
Love it.
So Martyrs in the same, it kind of deals with some similar kind of things from a very, very different perspective, but it's very brutal. It's another movie where you
Mhm.
essentially watch somebody that you care about from the movie just get tortured. And then in the end, the goal is for some kind of religious experience. So, I thought that fit pretty well, honestly. Also, too, there are aspects of this film, the kind of historical aspect of it, which I really enjoyed this time around. And from that aspect of it, I was trying to think of a movie that really captured the idea of the Salem witch trials, because like when Jesus is being questioned and things like that, it really felt like a kind of witch trial-esque thing
Mhm.
where you're trying to trap somebody and stuff like that. But I couldn't really think of like a really, really good one. So I ultimately went with The Witch, which also has the religious undertones and things going on in there for the historical aspect. And for the religious aspect, I thought A Dark Song might be a fun watch from people coming from this from a religious standpoint, as a religious horror film. That's
Yeah.
pretty light, not too
The
harsh.
The Witch also, I think it's kind of similar in tone in that like you know what's going on in The Witch, but they don't explain everything beat for beat. Like some of
Mhm.
it is just sort of a vibe, some of it you sort of have to glean on your own, and I think The Passion of the Christ does that as well. They don't necessarily connect every dot for you.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I thought that those three might be, depending on where you're coming from watching this film or listening to this show, it might be good recommendations. So, I think A Dark Song is pretty light, like even for people who aren't super into horror, but touching on religious things. Have you ever seen A Dark Song?
Yes, I actually watched it like within the last year because I've heard so many people recommend it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so it was not exactly what I expected.
Yeah, it's pretty different.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay. All right. So with that, now we can put that kind of lens aside, the horror adjacent aspect of it, and let's just kind of talk about the meat of this movie. And I had a couple things I wanted to touch on with you, and of course, feel free to go any direction you would like. But the first thing I was kind of curious about is, and you just touched on it actually, the narrative of this film. And I wanted to I wanted to ask you, do you think this film tells this narrative that we know? Do you think it tells it well? And do you think if somebody knew 0% about Jesus, about religion, about the Bible, do you think that they could come into this movie and follow it okay?
So I think it does a good job of telling this narrative, and I think I really appreciate how. I mean, the focus is the passion of the Christ, so the focus is the end of his life. But I really like how we get the little like flashbacks and scenes of like him with his mother, him with his disciples. We get to see him saving Mary Magdalene from being stoned to death. So I really like how the focus is on the end of his life and the
Mm-hmm.
seriousness of that, but we still get to see him like living his life as just a regular person.
Mm-hmm.
We get to see like, we get to hear his famous words and see like who he was in his ministry.
Mm-hmm.
However, I do think if you are not familiar with the story of Jesus, I don't think, like I said earlier, that it's an ABCD, like this is the story. And there's
Mm-hmm.
imagery in there that is just going to confuse you.
Yeah.
Like I know we'll get into it a little bit later, but like even the depiction of like Satan and such, I don't think you would know who that is. Now you would get the feeling that it's like an evil like entity, that it's like the antagonist, if you will. Like you would understand that, but you
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't understand like how does this all fit together? Why is there a snake? Like, so there
Mm-hmm.
are parts of it that if you're not familiar with the story, I think you would be just a little fuzzy.
Yeah, I didn't even think about the devil aspect. I just was like, yeah, me coming out, that's the devil. But yeah, that's a good point because they do some things where they have to kind of play that aspect where they're like, this is who this person is. Mostly, I think with the Marys in general, it's his mother. And so to give you some kind of emotional weight in why this person is watching this person, where I thought it was, or the one that stood out to me where I was like, man, people might really be confused about who this is and why they matter in any kind of way, was actually most of the disciples.
Mm.
Why are they
Mm-hmm.
with, who are these people? You can kind of generally get a sense that they're his friends, they're with him, they follow him in some kind of way. But they're splits, even some flashbacks, I think is it John that is with the Marys at the
Yes.
end? Okay. So
Yes.
John, we had these kind of flashbacks of during Jesus's teachings, but also sometimes it's just private conversations, which are most from the Bible. They're just presented as a private conversation with somebody. But I was like, yeah, people probably, if you came into this with zero understanding or even a loose understanding, even if you knew, yeah, Jesus, he died and, those basic kind of things, you might be really confused about the disciples' roles, who they are, why they
Yeah.
matter in this story, which is fine. It is secondary it is the story of Jesus and his burden and carrying his death. But it's something that I feel like they obviously need to include, but didn't want to give too much screen time to. And so I think that kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
hurts it a little
Especially
bit.
like when you understand more about the disciples, like it just adds like a richness to the story.
Mhm.
Like in the beginning when Peter cuts off the Roman soldier's ear, like, those of us who are really familiar with the Bible, and we're like, oh, Peter is a loose cannon, and like
Mhm.
John's the like steadfast, like loyal one.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that stuff you're not going to know. So if you do know it, it adds richness to the story. But so yeah, again, if you don't know that, it's just it might be just a little bit character development might be a little lacking.
Yeah, yeah, and even I mean, with the way that the story starts off, I mean, it's okay. But with Jesus praying in the garden, and I do like the added kind of distress, a little bit of it. It is that kind of push and pull, and they do it throughout the movie of the aspect of, is he human? Is he a god? And so one of the moments I almost wish, not necessarily we had more time with it, but of all the moments where things are given a lot of weight and a lot of emotional weight, I almost wish there was just a touch more in the garden of the distress, of the kind of weight about what's about to happen, because it really is one of the very few moments where there's a calmness to the screen, to the
Mhm.
environment. And I wish that we could have this kind of like calm setting and peace visually, but not in our character, where most of the time there's a lot of chaos going around him and he's kind of the rock. Um, so I kind of wish there was this kind of split and a little bit more time in the garden, but overall I still did like the scene, but yeah.
Yeah, I can get on board with that, especially since once he leaves the garden and they arrest him in the midst of like all of his, you know, in the midst of all of his torture and brutality and all of that stuff, he is very composed and he gives very like calm answers. He look like he's not sort of rattled. And so I do think that you're right. If we saw a little bit more of him struggling in the garden and then he comes away having settled that, having like wrestled with it, and he's like, now I'm gonna go do this. Yeah, I think that maybe would add just a little bit more like resonance to his attitude through the rest of the movie.
Yeah. I wanted so talking about the narrative, there are some flashback scenes. Some of
Mhm.
them are biblical, some of them are not, and some of them are kind of a mix of
Mhm.
those two aspects. We have there's this one that is not biblical, where Jesus is a carpenter and he's making some tables and chairs. And he's having a little moment with Mary, which is good
Mhm.
for him to have some moments with his mother to give us that emotional weight. So, um,
Yeah, that scene is really lovely.
yeah, yeah. And there, I guess it's that one where we get a lot of just time with him. And then there's one later where Mary is just remembering him as a child as he kind of runs and stumbles and she picks him up. And
Yeah, I think does that flashback happen when he is carrying the cross?
yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Like that scene is that's a heartbreaker.
I think it's when he stumbles with the cross,
Mhm.
and that's kind of the memory she has of him falling running as a child. So yeah, that's I do want to talk about that like just that aspect of Mary and the role she plays in this film and what she does for it. But yeah, that was a tough one. The combination of the cross and then the child is like, woo. Then we have when Jesus is being whipped, he like looks at the Roman soldier, and then he has that moment where he remembers the washing of the feet, which was a big biblical moment where
Mhm.
Jesus is humbling himself, washing his disciples' feet and everybody's feet. There is one too, a big moment. This is one that they kind of changed a little bit, where it's Mary Magdalene, but she's the whole, who can throw the first stone, who's perfect, who's without sin, cast the first stone, to protect the prostitute. I don't think in the Bible actually is Mary in that story. I could be wrong about that
I
though.
think it is.
Is it? Okay, maybe it is.
I'm
Okay.
pretty sure it is. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, so we have that moment which is biblical. We have the Sermon on the Mount is there,
Yes.
which is one of Jesus's big sermons. Palm Sunday a little bit, which is where Jesus rides into Jerusalem on the donkey and everybody is kind of like putting down the palm frond things, yeah, the palm
Mhm.
branches. And there's several. Sometimes they're just really quick. Sometimes they linger more. We do get a couple different scenes of the Last Supper as well. So, and again, I think like I think they're good enough because, like with the Last Supper, for instance, they show that one a couple times, and they take lines from Jesus where he's pouring it. Oop, sorry about that. Did you hear that?
I did.
Okay, sorry. When I'm sharing the volume for the bumps that comes in. So, all right, I'll cut that out. So yeah, like with the Last Supper scene, there's a couple times that they do it, and I think it makes enough sense from a narrative sense because it says he pours the wine. And he says like, "This is my blood, and take this in remembrance of me." But if somebody wasn't, I think it makes enough sense to where he had a meal with his disciples and he predicted that he was dying. People could probably get on that, but the whole like blood aspect, like this is my body, eat my body, and that connection to communion and what it means to the church, I think that would be completely lost on a non-religious person.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, that whole concept is, yeah, it's a little weirdo if you've not grown up with it, which by the way is like one of the things I love to examine about other religions, like when there are things they do that seem weird to us, to think about, well, yeah, but if you told somebody who had never heard of Christianity this thing or this thing or read them this story, it would seem insane, those things are always interesting to explore. And communion is one of those, like, why? Like,
Yeah,
why do
you're
we do
drinking
this? Yeah.
blood. It's like a total vampirism, which could tie in with horror. Um, but yeah, so I think these scenes, it's another one of those things where it's like you got to do it in a way. Like when you're making a movie about Jesus, I understand the motivation, but at the same time though, to play devil's advocate,
Mhm.
I know, yeah, I also do think that there's such like huge moments that religious people coming in are going to know so well, so intimately, but they're not given the like weight, or they're not given the kind of time that they really need. So I'm kind of back and forth on that at some points. Like I almost would say something like you need to pick three. And instead of having like 10 flashbacks that are all different stories, maybe you do like with the Last Supper, where they do a couple different flashbacks, but it's all to the same kind of scene. Maybe you
Mhm.
need to spend a little bit more time with some of these and not split it up so much. I don't know. Just a thought.
I mean, I could get on board with that because I think the flashbacks are really important
Mhm.
for two reasons. One, so we understand who Jesus was as like a teacher and a person. And two, because we need breaks. Like, if this really was just the last week of Jesus' life with no throwback to the rest of his life, like it would be a much more difficult movie to watch. And it wouldn't be as emotionally like resonant either. Um, but you might be right about picking fewer scenes and giving those scenes more context that would probably still communicate what needs to be communicated about Jesus as a man
Mhm.
and as a teacher.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's yeah, tough because the flashback with Mary, it does ground us in the emotional resonance of Mary that she's feeling. And so I think it makes sense to have those moments with his friends too. Then it does kind of like, who are these people watching Jesus die, denying him, all those kind of things. And then of course Mary's there too, so that's important. So I get that. But then yeah, I mean he's preaching the word of God. So we got to have Sermon on the Mount. Like it's just, I get it. I do, like, I understand the conflict. So I think for the most part they did about as well as you could probably do, old Mel, but maybe could have cleaned it up a scotch, maybe.
Also, I
Mhm.
wonder, yeah, well, he could have, and this would have invited probably more criticism.
Mm.
Um, but could he have taken like some of those stories and put them together into like put them together in a different way, right? But then
Could
then
be.
they wouldn't be like biblically accurate anymore.
Yeah.
Ooh, confetti.
Whoa.
Can we do it again?
Well, yeah, that was great.
um Anyway, so that again, that would have welcomed like more criticism probably because, oh, that's not how it happened in the Bible. But
Sure.
from a movie making standpoint, it might have been more elegant, more elegant way to tell some of those stories.
Well, yeah. Well, he already the scene of the chairs, that's not biblical. So he already was
Mm-mm.
willing to take those kind of like chances or risk or whatever to tell a more kind of resonance like story narrative for the
Mm-hmm.
film. And as you said before, I think that was kind of important to give it more of an emotional weight. But there was another one too, which I guess this is so it's not biblical, but it's like a Catholic thing, which I am not well versed in, so I apologize. But the woman who comes out to Jesus when he's carrying the cross, I think another time he collapses and she carries the towel and she kind of wipes his blood off of his face. That is a Catholic saint. And I guess that is a story that is not part of the regular Bible, but like that there's like this, I don't know, legend, I guess to call it, of this towel that's got Jesus' blood on it.
Mm.
This relic, you
Is it
know.
in the Apocrypha? Maybe.
Probably. Yeah. Yeah, that's why you're here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, even that aspect is not technically biblical or in the Bible. So, I mean, he was willing to take some chances in that aspect. So, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, this movie is a little over 2 hours long, just a little
Mhm.
over 2 hours long. So again, if this movie was made today, it would probably be 2.5 hours long.
Probably.
Um, because at the time, anything over 2 hours was really long, especially for an R-rated movie, especially for theatrical release.
Yeah.
But I do wonder if we had another 30 minutes, would that time be well spent with some of the like the flashback stuff? Personally, I don't need this movie to be longer. But if you were gonna add another 30 minutes to it, I think that kind of stuff would be what you would need to spend that time on.
Yeah, for sure. One other thing about so this isn't necessarily about the narrative, but kind of. The actor who plays Jesus has
Mhm.
blue eyes and they digitally changed them to brown in this movie. That was something that really stood out to me as being not so good.
Yeah, I mean, because of course we have all those jokes now about like white Jesus, and Jim
Yes.
Caviezel is like he looks like your typical painting of a white Jesus. So I guess that was like an attempt at least to be like we know Jesus doesn't have blue eyes, but like also like if you're gonna cast Jim Caviezel, just don't worry about it. Don't worry
Yeah.
about that. If
Or
you
give
know
him some
if
contacts.
Yeah, yeah. And I was like I said, I didn't rewatch it, but I was like watching a few clips before we started recording, and I was like,
Mhm.
why do his eyes look so wonky?
They look bad. They look bad. That's one of the one things that's done. It's because there's a couple times. I think it's mostly in the flashbacks. One, I think where he's reaching down to grab Mary Magdalene's hand or something, and she's like looking up at him. It's the face of Jesus, and it's just straight in the eyes, and they look like garbage. Honestly.
Oh, oh,
Yeah, it's like don't digital it. Well, and also it's 2004, so when you make choices like that, we're gonna digitally change his eyes. It's like okay, 20 years later, that's gonna look really bad.
yeah. Because most of the effects I feel like hold up pretty good, but yeah, those eyes are not great.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, just wanted to touch on that a little bit. To go to another topic though, one thing actually this time watching it, I thought was a really positive aspect for me in my adult state and not really attending church very much. And so I got the emotional aspect and the religious aspect, but actually it was the politics of the film. That was honestly probably like the most impressive thing to me this time around is how well I felt like with as much as like the narrative can maybe be muddy or not very clear because it's made for
Hmm.
people who know the story intimately, I thought the motivations of these kind of religious leaders, and then how Rome played into it, and how what they were trying to kind of avoid or appease the people in some kind of way, and like going back and forth. I actually that was the most interesting part to me, honestly.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe just like from a history nerd like standpoint, I was just because I feel, growing up in the church, I know the story of Jesus. And like even if somebody I said like knew 0% about Jesus, I mean, I feel like you kind of know the beats of Jesus. He died on a cross, at least, if anything. But the religious leaders and them like not being able to crucify Jesus themselves
Hmm.
based on their laws, and pushing it off and using the manipulation of what he's like questioning Caesar, and him, the Roman Pontius Pilate, like not wanting Pontius Pilate. Oh God, I'm gonna fuck up all the names.
Pontius, you're right.
Okay.
Pontius.
Thank you. Um, Pilate just like not really wanting to do it and being really confused about why he should in any way be
Yeah.
crucified, and him trying to pawn it off at first. So then they go to the other guy who's like over Jesus's district. And Jill's like, that was just because I was thinking to myself, like, oh, the Roman Empire, like how far it's expanded and how these people resent it, and how they're like, we got to avoid this uprising. And we only like this post fucking sucks. Like, I don't want to be out here, and these people are going to rise against me and they're going to cause a bunch of trouble. And I just got to kill this guy. It was, yeah, I actually thought that was handled really well. Did you not really care for those aspects of it?
No, I mean, so here is this is like complicated because um like there in reality, one of the things that people criticize about this movie is they say that it has anti-Semitic tones in it.
Okay.
And that's twofold. One is because like Mel Gibson, just as a person, I guess, has like made some problematic comments,
That's
right?
fair. Yep.
But yeah, right. Mel Gibson is a little cray, right? Um, but I've heard criticism that like that this film takes the perspective that like the Jews are responsible for like the death of Jesus, right?
Mhm.
I personally, I don't feel that this film presents that story at all. I think that I guess this is one of those things, if you don't know the story, you might not realize, but like to me, it's like Jesus is Jewish, his disciples are Jewish, his friends are Jewish, like his followers are Jewish, like they're all Jewish, right? And so, like, to me, it's very clearly like the religious elite, the
Mhm.
authority, like they're the ones that are responsible, not like the Jews as like a people. Um, and it's like authority at every level is responsible for it. So it's like the religious authority, the Roman authority, and like you're right, everybody's just pawning it off on somebody else because like no one really wants to take responsibility for it. And
Mhm.
like you said, it's a delicate structure. So it's interesting to me because of just the different ways people view this story and like what it
Mhm.
means, in a larger a larger like world context. Um,
Yeah.
but also, I mean, I've always like in church and everything. I mean, that's kind of how it was always presented to me is that um you don't want to be like the religious leaders because they're not willing to listen and they don't love the poor and the downtrodden, and that
Mhm.
Jesus would prefer to be in the company of these people. And the only time Jesus ever got worked up or angry was at the religious elite and the people in authority. And he was very kind and forgiving to others. And so I've always viewed it that way.
Mm.
But it is interesting to know that there are people out there who view it differently.
Mm. And that's absolutely fair. That's yeah, that's a good perspective that honestly, I just I wasn't even considering. I wasn't even thinking. I know that Mel Gibson has some controversy around him as a person. But so I had kind of mentioned before, even when I gave my recommendation of The Witch, of I was viewing it from this perspective of, yeah, it's just people in power. So it wasn't even that they were Jewish in any kind of
Mm-hmm.
capacity, because actually, I think it did a really good job of separating the elite from not the elite. Not that they were Jewish, it's that they're elite. You know, they want to remain in power. They don't want to be questioned. They want to have the say over, you know, what people listen to and stuff. And so that's where I thought it kind of put it in a good perspective, because even people like is it Simon who helps them carry the cross? He's just this guy, you know, and
Yeah.
he actually stands, and even the relationship with the Roman soldiers, he actually stands up to the Roman soldiers, like, if you keep beating him, I'm not going to carry this cross anymore, you know, and the kind of frustration of the regular people who have to live under the tyranny of the religious elite, and then on top of the social elite of the Romans and things like that. And so that's, yeah, but that's a good point. I could totally see that, but I liked it more from the aspect of I could easily associate what happened to Jesus, for instance, with somebody like that was in the Salem witch trials, who is just getting talked around in circles. They're finding some way to
Mm-hmm.
trip you up, to throw you under the bus. And it's just because they're religious elite. Those are Christians, these are Jews. But that's not the aspect. It's the manipulation aspect, you know?
Right. Yeah. It's the authority and the threat
Mhm.
to power and the threat to order. That is the
Mhm.
problem.
And it actually, for the whole, you know, growing up in a church where they always say it was God's plan and it had to happen and Jesus had to die. It was actually nice to actually have a realistic reason why somebody would want to just kill this man. You know, if some, and even, can you imagine a man showing up in a mega church today being like, I'm God? Who would not get mad at that guy? You know what I'm
Oh,
saying?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. We had that conversation actually in my church this past year. We were talking about like the early church,
Hmm.
and how, the idea of this man showing up and saying he was the Messiah in Jewish culture. I mean, that was like blasphemy.
Hmm.
And so it was very difficult for them to accept. And we talked about that. Like, can you imagine if, like, in our church now, someone, came out and was like, oh, I'm the second coming, like, I'm Christ returned.
Hmm.
We would be just like the Jewish people. We would be like, you're crazy. Like that,
Mm.
it would take a lot for you to believe that, oh, this person, oh, wow, okay, you actually are who you say you are.
Mhm.
So yeah, when you think about it that way, I mean, then like you said, it's easier to accept that, oh, we must get rid of this person because he's
Yeah.
making a splash.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I thought that was handled well, because it was one of those moments too, I guess, where Jesus, I guess he still is, because he's always one up on him. You know, he's got the answers, but it's one of those moments where I guess Jesus isn't just painted. Every other time he's saying these very, you know, deep things, or we have this deep emotional attachment to it. Otherwise, it was just like, you know, why would somebody do this? What, you know, sometimes biblical things can seem so obscure, of like, why, you know, what's going on here? But I thought the groundedness of that was really appealing to me.
Yeah, filled in all of the little nuance gaps for
Yeah.
you.
And to give this movie credit too, you know, I was speaking before of the craft aspect, but so I guess in this film, there's three different languages that are spoken. Jesus and his disciples speak Old Aramaic. The Jewish authorities speak Hebrew, and the Romans speak Latin, and Jesus speaks all three on different occasions, which is something that, you know, if you're just reading this film, you just came in, you're just like reading this film, which I couldn't like pick out, oh, that's Latin. But like the craft of it, of reading that afterwards and, you know, knowing that that's going on, it's like, damn, that's pretty good.
Yeah, I love
Yeah.
that choice. I love
Yeah.
it. I remember it being real weird at the time
Mhm.
when we all heard it was going to be in different
Yeah. Different
languages,
language.
but like I don't know. I think it adds a level of, again, of like realism and seriousness to it just, I don't know. I think, again, it just, to me, it's a really respectful choice for the story.
Yeah, I agree. I like that choice. And generally I liked all the choices of yeah, just the back and forth politics and all of it. I like that. Let's the brutality of this film. I want to talk about the brutality of this film.
Get right
So
into it.
you didn't watch this film again for this episode. You've seen it many times and you felt very comfortable to talk about it.
Mhm.
But was the brutality a main motivation for not wanting to watch this again?
Um, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. Not, I mean, not just the brutality. The whole movie in general is like, I have to be in like a certain frame of mind. Like, I don't want to look at my phone. I want to be serious. I want to watch it. I want to give it my full attention. Um, and I've watched it, I think, 3 times in my
Mhm.
life. So, no, I've watched it a ton of times, but I mean, that's because, again, I don't know. It's because it's an emotionally important movie and because I have to be in a certain frame of mind. It's just not like a casual, I can just throw it on whenever.
Yeah.
And the brutality is just part of that, probably a big part, but I mean, we've watched all kinds of stuff. I mean,
We've watched some messed up stuff.
God, I've seen so many things at this point in my life. And like, okay, let me think about this. I realize I'm rabbit trailing a little bit, but it'll all come back around. So 2004, this came out.
Mhm.
I'm trying to remember when I started watching New French Extremity. Probably not until 2006 or 7.
Well, because even High Tension, I don't think came out until maybe 2007. Martyrs was 2008. So
Okay.
yeah, it would. And then Calvaire was 2008 or nine, I believe. So
Okay. So,
yeah.
yeah. So this was before all of that. I believe the first time I saw American Psycho, I didn't see it till 2005. So yeah, I had not seen some of the ones that really stick out in my mind is like,
Yeah.
oh, I had not seen most of that yet.
Mm.
So I do think that when I first saw this movie, it was probably one of the most violent things I had ever seen at that point. Um, and so that might be part of it. That might be part of why it still holds kind of a little bit of a, I don't know what the right word to use is. I don't know, maybe just a little bit more of like a sacred place in my movie
Yeah.
viewing,
Mhm.
I think that might be part of it. Um, but to me, I think that the brutality in this film is completely justified and completely earned. I do not find it excessive. I don't find it offensive. Um, sure, it's uncomfortable. It's a little hard to watch. But I remember growing up in church, going to so many Easter plays, and, I was being taught about everything that Jesus went through. But then I would go to these little Southern church Easter plays, and he's like fully robed. There might be a little bit of blood, maybe, but
Mm.
probably not.
Yeah.
Which understandable. You're at a church. There are families, like it's not appropriate to like realistically depict any kind of violence against Christ for lots of reasons.
Yeah.
However, um when I learned about this movie and heard it was going to be R and that it was going to like accurately depict Christ's suffering, like that to me was a draw. And I thought, this is important. Like,
Mm.
you know, and I think especially like as horror fans, we do not shy away from difficult things, from difficult topics. And it doesn't mean that we like enjoy violence or like relish, terrible things.
Mhm.
Um, but I just think that the same reason why we like to watch difficult things in horror is the reason why this movie resonates with me. And I think that the brutality is a big part of that.
Mm.
To me, if I had gone to this movie and they took it so seriously and portrayed it the way they did, and then they had shied away from the brutality, I think I would have felt a little bit ripped off.
That's a good
Like
point. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I've seen this before. Why am I
Yeah.
here again? I've seen Jesus movies, I've seen Jesus TV shows, I've seen plays. Like, why is this different? Why is this special? You know? So I don't know. To me, that it's an important part of the film. What do you think?
Well, there's this. So going off of that, there's this crazy memory that lives in my mind. That this is a little bit of a tangent, but also kind of touches on that, where this is so crazy. Also, when I was a kid, at one point in my life, I don't even remember somebody watching it on a regular basis, but there was an episode of Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman. I think that's even, I just have this distinct memory in my mind where there is this community is coming together and they're banning books and they're going to burn them because they're so outrageous, they're so disgusting, and they're teaching things that are so terrible. And when somebody steps in, I don't know if it's a preacher or I don't know any of the characters, but somebody steps in and was like, if you're going to burn all these books, you also need to include this one. It has a story about God gambling with the devil and and rape and all torture and all of the terrible things that are included in the Bible. And he's like, and it's the Bible, and I think what you're saying is important too, because even talking about the aspect of kids, I mean, yeah, I guess in some ways you have to balance things, but also at the same time, it's like you're teaching kids from the age of 0, 1, 2, going to kindergarten about Jesus Christ. And you have pictures of crosses, you wear them around your necks. And it's like, that was a torture device. It literally was used to intimidate and suppress people, like regions, and keep them in line and intimidate them in the worst kind of way, because it's a terrible, terrible death. And so, things get sugar coated a lot. And then this righteous kind of indignation of, oh, how dare that happen? Or how dare, it's like you worship this thing or these ideas or this book that is some of the most brutal, vile things that anyone could ever imagine. And you're going to make a movie about the figurehead of that religion. How could you not include that in it? So yeah, I think the brutality is absolutely necessary for all the times that you just kind of like skimp out on that or sugarcoat everything or cut corners on like what you kind of want to brush under the rug because it's not easily consumable. So yeah, I mean, I do agree in that aspect. I hope that didn't sound too harsh.
No, I know. I feel this. I feel the same way, but it's just, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it is the distinguishing factor of this movie, because, well, even up until that point, I mean, I think this is the most well-made movie about Christ. There have since been other things that were also pretty well done. But to me, because Mel Gibson chose to go there and to do it and to like have the guts to do it, that is what makes this movie special. And I know, and yeah, same as you, like that feels kind of terrible to say. But for Christians, I mean, Jesus's willingness to go through that for his people is what makes that's like the cornerstone of our faith. I mean, the resurrection is the cornerstone of our faith, but that piece of it, his willingness to go through these terrible things and to be sacrificed, and like he says, like, the greater love has no man, and like that he who lays his life down for his friends. And even in this movie, like he quotes that in the Last Supper about like laying down your life for your friends. So I mean, that is just, it's really important. It's difficult, but it's really important, and it's what makes this movie special.
It is. On the flip side, devil's advocate again. On the flip side, There is this kind of aspect looking at it objectively as a film. When I was considering what kind of subgenre could you put this into, I was considering putting snuff film because essentially this movie is designed to show you somebody's brutal death. That is the goal. I mean, like
Mhm.
also you get the resurrection at the end, but in all of the gritty details of the beatings and the blood and the ripping of the skin and the piercing and everything, the humiliations, the beatings that go down to it, it all leads, to that moment. And it's designed that way to get an emotional reaction out of you, whether it happened that way or not. And that's the purpose of why it's in this film. Um, and it's kind of the way to kind of like give an aspect. I remember kind of thinking this the very first time I saw it, because if you grow up in a church from age 0, it is implanted in your mind, this idea of Jesus and he loves you, this infinite love and what somebody went through. And it would be like, imagine if you were a kid and, you know, one day there was a car wreck and the car caught on fire and your father, who you loved and who everyone has always told you he loved you so much and he saved you, risked his life, sacrificed his life to save you. And there was just this video of your father burning alive in a car to save your life. That's not something you would just want to watch. It's not something you would like be like, I really respect my father sacrificed his life for me, so let me watch this video of him burning alive in a car. That's not, it doesn't make it
Yeah.
better.
No, that's not a thing you would want. That is not a thing you
So
would want.
so having this film that is essentially a snuff film about that people grow up having this emotional attachment to as if it was your father or your someone that you love in your life, and then just essentially have him beaten and ripped apart and killed in one of the worst like torture devices that's ever existed in the history of man. It's like that's also a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah. Which
Yeah.
I guess
Yeah.
is why some people don't want to watch this movie. And
Sure.
that's why
Yeah.
some people don't like it. They're like,
Hmm.
I don't understand why are we doing this?
Yeah.
But when you're a person like me
Yeah.
who's got darkness built in, it's like I need the balance. I gotta see it.
Yeah. No, I'm definitely with you. I
Yeah.
definitely I remember having that thought when I first watched it because I wasn't into horror at the time. And now I could say something like, my Martyrs is one of the most respectable films I can think of, and which is another film that is just kind of rivals the brutality of this
Hmm.
movie, because I think the reason I say that about Martyrs is because I think the brutality is very important to the craft of that film and
Hmm.
the message that that film's trying to tell. And I feel the same way about this film as a
Yeah.
piece of art. I think it's
Yeah.
important. So
That's a
I
that's a
don't share
good
that idea, but I think that's so I just want to bring that up.
the comparison with Martyrs is really good for me personally because like I said, I don't just pull this movie out very often.
Mhm.
I have watched Martyrs 1.5 times, and
Yeah.
that's it.
Hmm.
Even though I love it, I don't know if I will ever revisit that movie,
Yeah.
Um, and it's just again, it's a hard one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And sometimes like it just so happens earlier this year, I watched Grave of the Fireflies for the first time. Have you ever seen that before?
No.
It's an animated film. It's a Studio Ghibli film, and
Mhm.
it's about war. It just follows these two kids, and it's just one of the most. I never ever want to watch it again. But it's also one of the most beautiful little like films I've ever seen, and it's just like some things like your soul kind of needs to experience, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you want to revisit it. So
Yep.
yeah.
100%.
All right, I don't want to go too long, but I did finally. So let's touch on, since we're talking about it from a horror standpoint a little bit. Let's go back. There is like some horror elements, like straight up, there's
Mhm.
some horror elements in here. There's
Mhm.
like a couple of jump scares, for God's sakes. Demons, the devil, uh, hell a little bit. How do you think they're portrayed in this film? Well, okay. Like, what do you think?
I love it, honestly.
Okay. Okay.
Like the androgynous nature of Satan and
Hmm.
like Satan's voice in this movie. I love it. I think it's beautiful. It's not anything that could have ever come out of my brain.
Hmm.
Um, and it's unlike any other depiction of Satan I have ever seen. Um, and I just loved it. That and then okay, well, let me ask you what you think. So the scene where Satan is carrying that weird, grotesque baby,
Yeah.
how did you feel about it? And what do you think it means?
Well, honestly, I don't think that they're very good. From a couple different standpoints. One, and it's hard too because of the date of this movie. So to be fair, it came before a lot about what I'm about to say. Is that in some ways it kind of reminds me of Lord Voldemort. Like it kind of just looks like he's kind of got that same black hood, palish snake like kind of skin. And then but I did find it interesting, and now because we do watch so many horror things, like the kids who turn into demons and then you literally have like jump scares, it really does seem like something that I would see out of like Annabelle 3 or something like that. Which again, to be fair, 2004, a lot of it's CG, and just
Mhm.
the way they do the demon's face. I don't think really any of the CG holds up well in this movie. There's not a lot of it, and so for the
Mhm.
most part, it's not that big of a deal. But like the eyes and some stuff they do later, CG just doesn't look great. And so I found it entertaining that there was, I think, about 2 jump scares that were meant to be like, rah, and see, I was like, that's like kind of wild to think about in this Jesus movie. But yeah, I so, and then the baby too. I wasn't crazy about it because on the flip side, other than just how it looks, I honestly, outside of like The Witch, which is probably one of my favorite portrayals of the devil, I'm kind of tired of the devil being this sinister being. The devil's supposed to tempt you. Like, if anything, I would want the devil to be the secret character in the film who's like looks like Jesus's best friend or a beautiful woman or something, who's saying like, you don't need to do this. You don't, like, these people hate you, like tempting him in a seductive way. Anytime the devil's portrayed, he's this monster that you would run away from. The devil
Mhm.
is, his whole existence in the religious sense is to tempt you. It's the things that you want that seem much better than the situation that you're in, not another monster on the other side. So in some ways, I'm kind of tired of that portrayal of the devil. I feel like the devil needs to be more seductive in my eyes, but
Mhm.
not to poo poo on your thoughts and
I mean,
opinions.
like you're not wrong in general, but for
Yeah.
this movie,
Hmm.
I think that would be too I think that would be too abstract for this
Do you?
particular story. Yeah, in a movie that's already
Hard to follow.
a
Yeah.
little symbolic and a little visual. Although, have you seen The Last Temptation of Christ?
Have actually. So when you were talking about it, I was all smiles
Yeah.
because I watched it to prepare for this movie. And so that's
Oh.
like the swerve. I had never seen it before. The swerve they do, I was like,
So
whoa,
see, well, what
yeah.
you're talking about of having Satan portrayed differently in a different
Yeah.
light, that movie does that very well.
Hmm.
Um, so to me, like, I think like at this point, like Jesus is going to recognize Satan because of where we are in this story, and it is, I think, important that like we get right to it.
Hmm.
So like that didn't like strike me as cliche at all. Maybe if
Hmm.
I saw it for the first time now, it would. But just purely the visual aspect I thought was so again, especially at the time, just like super refreshing.
Mm.
And I read a theory about the baby because I remember being real confused by the baby in
Yeah.
2004. Now I wouldn't be, because I've seen there's all kinds of weird stuff in like Renaissance and medieval paintings. There's lots of weirdness. But I read, this is not an original thought. I read that there's lots of theories, but several people said that that was like an inversion of like the Madonna and Child. Like you often see the
Mm.
painting of Mary and baby Jesus, and that was supposed to be like a grotesque kind of reflection of that, sort of like
That's fair.
mocking that idea. And
Mhm.
I thought that was like a cool thing. But also I was just like, Mel Gibson, good for you. You put a weird baby in this movie. Like you knew you were going to show this movie to evangelicals and you put a weird baby
Mhm.
in it. Like I just love I'm here for the weirdness of it. And even though the demon kids that are like taunting Judas, like
Mhm.
I agree, like at this point, that effect is a little cliche. But again, I thought it was a wise choice to portray like how Judas might have felt after he's made this bad decision and he's like sort of tortured about it, clearly, because he commits suicide.
Yeah.
Um, that's how he would maybe see the world, is that even children look like monsters to him now. So again, conceptually, I really like that idea. Like visually, is it a little cliche at this point? I think you have a valid argument. But conceptually, I think it's strong.
And that is a good point. So I will say I do respect the weirdness of the baby, because again, I'll always respect a craft standpoint when I'm able to recognize, like, I know who you're making this movie for. I know who it is. Like, then yeah, the baby is a bold choice. And I can say, like, whoa, that's really wild. Now, to be fair though, on this in that same aspect, I would say that the demon children to me, so the baby is weird and crazy, good for you. The demon children almost lean into that more like black and white of the Christianity, like see Jesus or like Judas, he betrayed him and now he's haunted by demons. That's what'll happen to you if you're bad. It kind of almost has a little bit too
Yeah.
much of that, like, okay.
Mm,
So I do respect the one aspect, but the demon kids, I
yeah.
don't
Well,
know.
and like I would not want that to be the takeaway from that personally, because
Yeah.
like I have kind of a soft spot for people like that in the Bible. Like I always feel sorry for Pharaoh. I feel
Yeah.
sorry for Pilate and his poor wife. I
Yeah.
feel sorry for Judas. I always feel sorry for these people because I'm like, yes, they made choices, but like you said earlier, we were always taught, well, this had to happen. Like
Yeah.
this had to happen. Jesus was always going to die. This is the plan. And so you think about people like Pilate and people like Judas, and you're like, they're just part of this plan. Like, did they even really get to like decide? And of course, I always want to believe like the best about people. And I always want to like give people the benefit of the doubt and believe that like things are always more complicated than they seem. Um, so I would like to see Judas given a little more consideration and a little more nuance. So hopefully, I hope that that was not the intention in that choice,
Yeah.
but
That's fair
it
enough.
might have
Yeah.
been. It might have been.
That's fair enough. Okay. So we kind of touched on the kind of emotional resonance and everything like that. We've been talking. I want to give you a chance to kind of just like lay it all out there, just all your thoughts, your opinions, this whole piece together. Out of 5 stars, if you can do it, how do you feel about it? How do you what would you give The Passion of the Christ?
Okay. Hopefully this is not too rambly. I mean, I've said pretty much everything I want to say. Um, so here it goes. Here goes my rambly thoughts. As we said, I appreciate all the little glimpses we get into Jesus's like everyday life, and that we get to see him like as a teacher and as a friend and as a son. I think that's all really important. I think this movie is very artful. Love the choice to do it in different languages. I think this story is just given like a lot of space. Like one of the really beautiful scenes is Jesus with Mary Magdalene, and he's like drawing the line in the sand, and all the Pharisees are kind of like out of focus in the background. And that's just like a very emotional sort of moving. There's a lot of that happening that I really appreciate. Um, like I said, also here for Satan, here for that creative choice. Really love it. Love that opening Garden of Gethsemane like scene in general. That whole scene is beautiful, and Satan's inclusion in it is part of that to me. You know, most Christian movies, like I said, are just terrible. And mostly because they're cheesy and they're surface level, and they are black and white, and there's no room for nuance, and there's no room for doubting, and there's no room for questions. And I think because this movie is kind of artful and a little bit sparse in its storytelling, it gives you a little bit of room to like contemplate and like think about these things a little bit, even though it is told from the definitely from the perspective that Jesus is the Lord. And I think too, I think this movie resonates with me, not just because I'm a Christian, but also because I am a horror fan. I think I can really appreciate the uniqueness and the importance of the violence and the brutality in a way that maybe others can't. Mm. And to me, the combination of the artfulness and the glimpses we get into Jesus's life, paired with the brutality that we get, it gives us a really just balanced story that I can appreciate as both a film lover and a person of faith. And to me, it all goes back to like balance. And so Easter is the big Christian holiday, right? It's the big Christian holiday. Christmas is big, but Easter is really the big important one. But one thing that has always seemed lacking to me is so many Christians just gloss over Good Friday. A lot of Christians don't do anything to celebrate Good Friday. They just gloss over it and they move on to Easter. And especially in probably maybe the last like 5 to 10 years, I have really taken care to do something on Good Friday to reflect on the suffering and the death of Christ, because I think it's really important to then understand like the joy of Easter. And I think those two things, they're really important to celebrate together. And so it's the same thing with this movie. I think that is why when this movie came out, I felt like it was a missing piece of the story that we had never gotten as Christians. We had just never seen this in cinema. And even as a kid, I used to feel, like you said, sugar-coated. I used to feel kind of ripped off that we weren't taking the full story seriously. So anyway, because of all that stuff, to me, this is a 4.5 out of 5 for me.
Okay. So I've known you for a long time now. I didn't really know how you felt about this movie before coming into this show. I really wanted to, you're covering religion and horror, and you know, I know kind of like your religious background. I knew you would like respect it, and I respect your opinion on religion and film, but I didn't realize that you held it in such high regard. So that's cool. Yeah. It's cool to hear that perspective. Yeah. I really appreciate that.
I can be pretty critical and pretty cynical when it comes to like organized religion. Mm-hmm. And I try not to harp on it too much in my show because nobody just wants to hear me complain about church all the time. But like I said, I am still a practicing Christian. So there's lots and lots of good, positive things there. And so I think talking about this movie has brought out a lot of my, a lot of the good, warm things associated with the faith as opposed to my complaining anyway.
All right. All right, so I'm going to give an out of 5 rating on this. I do want to kind of put this in perspective, so I'll save the final rating till the very end of my little rant. But I came into this wanting to be kind of as objective as possible. I watch a lot of movies now, to the point where almost like one a day. We review movies a lot, but I just generally enjoy watching film now and talking about film a lot. And I really, having not seen this movie in a long time and growing up as this kid in a church and having the context around that being the first watch, I really wanted to kind of go the opposite end and be like, I want to be as objective as possible about this film. So, with that in mind, I was really kind of surprised and impressed by the groundedness of the politics and how easy it was for me to understand. And I could totally see the perception of, the anti-Semitic, things, but like that just didn't register with me at all. I really just the Roman aspects of it, the different languages and stuff like that, all of that was just, I thought, like, really one of the shining lights for me for this film, watching it from like just really kind of trying to step back and be like, what's good about this film. That was the highlight to me, honestly. So I really appreciated that. I kind of agree with you. I think the brutality in this movie is not a problem for me. Um, I get why it is hard for people in the way I described earlier, but watching it at this point too, as myself, thinking about the first time I watched it, now I'm in like this neutral zone. I'm not even like bitter or unpacking baggage. I'm just like, I don't want to go to church on a weekly basis, but when I travel to Paris, I'm going to Notre Dame. I want to see the art that this
Mhm.
faith has inspired in people. In the same way, I want to go, I'm not Buddhist, but I want to go to the Buddhist temples up in the mountains. And the idea of art or religion inspiring art is very interesting to me and has created some of the longest lasting, most beautiful things that humanity has ever created. And so looking
Mhm.
at this film and through that way, I think that the brutality is good and necessary and like doesn't bother me now anymore, because I'm not thinking about like my father burning in a car, somebody doing that. It's like, oh, wow, this is kind of powerful in that kind of way. On the flip side of that, though, man, I really do think it goes back and forth because it's made for a certain audience, and I don't think it transcends past that. And so there is a lot of pandering in this movie, and a lot of the emotional resonance that comes with it comes from. I felt like, not to be bitter about it, but it felt like it came from a perception of pandering. So, like, if Jesus isn't getting beaten, and most of the time he is, when he is getting beaten, there's like this very heavy-handed emotional music that's swelling throughout it. It's like you're not allowed to just naturally kind of feel an emotion of like, damn, that man's getting beaten and that really sucks. It's got the swelling and the slow motion, and like in almost every scene that's not just like Jesus talking or somebody talking, it's very, very like pandery a little bit. Like, now you need to feel sad about this. It's like, yeah, I'm gonna feel sad about this. This innocent man's getting beaten. Let me feel sad about that. Like, just like let me feel it a little bit. And so in some way, and again, I kind of feel that a little bit about like the devil and the demons too. It's like, isn't this evil? Isn't this bad? It's like, yeah, it's bad. Just humans beating a man for no reason is bad. That's enough for me in some ways. So it kind of goes back and forth for me from an objective standpoint of like, what is this movie telling and what does it do? It's got some really good things and takes a lot of bold choices that I respect the hell out of. And even though I don't think it like looks that great, I do respect the baby choice and the beating choices and the like when they switch from the canes to the whips that have these like shells or nails on them, and they like rip at his ribs and like one hits him in the eye. It's like it's one of the most brutal things I've seen, watching these over the top, ridiculous horror movies. It's brutal, and I respect the hell out of that because that's not what people want to see generally.
Mhm.
So hell yeah, put it on the big screen, literally show it to 14-year-olds, 13-year-olds. Like, damn, that's wild, damn the R system, get in here, 10-year-olds. But but
Ah.
yeah, with that though, I think it's gonna end up a little bit more slightly more positive because of these big swings. That I do respect. And I do think it's artfully done. Unfortunately, a lot of the CG doesn't hold up. There's one more too where like Jesus says like it's when he dies and there's like either a drop of blood or rain or both come together and like splash on the ground. It's like
Do you know what
CG.
that's supposed to be?
I don't know what that's supposed to be. What's that supposed to be?
It's supposed to be a tear from the
From
Father.
God. Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah. I assume because it's like it goes with this like drop of blood from Jesus and it like looks like a raindrop
Mm.
like coming down. I was like, okay, yeah. So
Yeah. Which, by the way, I wasn't a huge fan of that choice,
yeah.
but yeah, I was
Mostly
like, did we need that? I don't know.
Mostly it's the CG that just I'm just like, man, if you can avoid that CG, just do it. Give that man
Yeah.
some contacts. Don't make God cry.
Yeah,
You know,
we're in ancient times. We don't need to do
yeah,
anything fancy. Just
we
it's
don't.
no.
Yeah. So yeah, overall though, I'm gonna give this objectively a 3 out of 5. So I did think it was slightly more positive. I did respect some things about it. I didn't feel the need to like come in and like bash it or tear it apart, be like, oh, this is pandry bullshit or anything like that. I thought like, yeah, in the same way that you said too, kind of my point earlier of like just being like kind of neutral about it and my personal feelings. I'm like, man, it's unfortunate to me that these biblical stories do have so much kind of weight around them in just the atmosphere because there's some
Mhm.
stories to be told that are really engaging. Like, God, would I love an amazing, well respected film that told the story of David and Bathsheba? Is it?
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
just because that's a wild story. It's just so wild.
Yeah.
Not even David and Goliath. I don't care about that. I want to know about the story about him taking this dude's wife and sending him to war. Like that's
Yeah.
crazy.
I mean, that's drama. I
Yeah.
I I agree. I think that like the Bible is just there are so many good stories in there, but 100% I want a filmmaker with no emotional attachment to make that story. That's who
Yeah.
I
And
want to see
just
do it.
like in the same way that folklore movies now like get my attention and just like, oh, is this
Mhm.
based in something? What does this come from? Who's telling these stories? Like, where did you get the source material? The Bible is also, it's got some stories that it's just unfortunately they also have a lot of weight around them.
Yeah,
So it's
it would
hard
be
to
it
get
would
things
be
like that made.
difficult. Yeah, it really would be difficult. But I am so happy to hear that like you had a good positive experience. And it
Yeah.
sounds like this movie maybe exceeded your expectations a little bit on a second watch. And like, because for me, like it's impossible for me to be objective about this movie, I think
Well,
for lots
sure.
of
Yeah.
reasons. So I've enjoyed hearing your perspective.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad I was able to like I was I was a little worried I was gonna watch it and be like, oh God, this is pretty terrible. Like I saw it when I was young and it was through that Christian lens. But yeah, I was actually
Yeah.
pretty pleased. Like I said, man, the politics of it, I was just like, whoa, yeah, okay. Whoa, what am I watching? Like Gladiator over here or something? Like, I don't know.
Jesus.
I was about that. Yeah. So cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you
You
for
know, I had a
having.
similar feeling, like, the last time I watched it,
Mhm.
like, I had a similar feeling. I was really worried that it wasn't gonna hold up
Yeah.
because I was in a very different place, like, the first couple times I watched it than I was the last time I watched it, and I
Mhm.
was like, "Oh, this held up better than I expected now that my perspective has changed." So
Yeah. Yeah. I'm happy about that. Yeah.
mhm.
Honestly, like I said, art that's inspired by religion is fine. It's given us some of the best art in the world. So that's great.
Absolutely.
So, all right. Well, cool. Thank you so much for having that discussion with me. I was a little worried about it, but feel better now. So let's let our hair down. Let's kind of like, loosen up a little bit. Let's play our Rotten Tomatoes segment. Okay, so this is our Rotten Tomatoes game. Actually, we play this on our Straight Chilling podcast, but we have to switch it up a little bit for this show because there's only two of us. So you're playing against the house tonight, Nichole. So the idea is we're going to play 3 rounds. Okay, so you will have a chance to guess which score is higher between some some movies I've picked. So we'll go between Passion of the Christ from 2004 and a couple different other like religious kind of movies. So let's start with the critic score. So you're going to be guessing which is higher, Passion of the Christ from 2004, or as you mentioned before, Noah from 2014, directed by Darren Aronofsky. Aronofsky, yeah.
I think Passion of the Christ will be higher.
On the critic score. Okay.
Yes.
So Passion of the Christ is higher on the critic score. Okay. I will tell you at the end what all of the scores are.
Okay.
But the next one. So actually, so I was trying to prepare for this. I did watch Noah for the first time to prepare for this. I did not get to this film though. So I have actually never seen it before, to be fair. Ben-Hur from 1959 also apparently has Jesus in it. Have you seen that movie?
Yes, Ben-Hur is a very sneaky Christian movie.
Okay. Yeah. I know it's got the reputation. I knew like Jesus was in it. I've just never seen. I wanted to watch it. I just, with everything on it, I didn't have the time before this drop. So, okay, movie. I'll still keep it on my list then. So from, 1959, let's do the audience score. Do you think Ben-Hur or Passion of the Christ is higher on the audience score?
This is difficult for several reasons. I'm like, oh, Ben-Hur's so old. How many people have seen it that are willing to then go rate it? Oh gosh. And then man, them evangelicals really loved Passion of the Christ. But I'm gonna say Ben-Hur is higher.
Okay. Ben-Hur is higher on the audience score. Okay, got that down. And then finally, as we have discussed and talked about earlier, The Last Temptation of Christ, which was not from 1988, as Scorsese directed it, starring Willem Dafoe as Jesus. So I'll let you choose. Do you want the critic score or the audience score on this one?
Let's be people of the people. So let's do the audience score.
Okay. So do you think Last Temptation of Christ is or Passion of the Christ is higher in the audience score?
I think Passion of the Christ is higher.
Okay.
I think Last Temptation is just too controversial.
Okay. It was a wild, when I was watching that movie, we need to talk about that sometime, because when I was watching it, also the same with Noah. The movies I watched for this, I was like, this is all just a wild experience. This is some crazy stuff.
I wish I could have been a fly on the wall.
Man, there's nothing straightforward about any of these movies I'm watching. Okay. So to go down the list, the only thing I don't have is the number of people who voted for the critics or the audience score, but Passion of the Christ 2004, the overall critic score is 49%, so not certified fresh. The audience score, however, is 80%, so much more positive on the audience side. Noah, so you said that you think the critic score for Passion of the Christ is higher than Noah. The critic score for Noah was 75%. So Noah is higher. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. My memory is not serving me well, because I remembered that movie just being hated by everyone. So
now your memory probably serves you right, because the audience score for Noah is 41%. So flipped on that one.
People couldn't handle those rock angels. They couldn't handle it.
They could not. And so, so 49 for Passion of the Christ, 80% for the audience, 75 for critics, 41 for audience for Noah. So almost like completely opposites. Crazy. Ben-Hur. So you said that you thought the audience was higher on Ben-Hur. You were correct. So Ben-Hur's critic score is 85%. The audience score is 89%, close to Passion of the Christ, but slightly higher on Ben-Hur. So good job. And finally, The Last Temptation of Christ. So you went with the audience score. You said you thought The Passion of the Christ was higher because Last Temptation of Christ is so kind of weird. That was incorrect. Audience score on Last Temptation of Christ, 84%. That's surprising,
Oh, that
honestly.
is.
Because when I watched that movie, I didn't know what to expect, and I was very surprised. I was like, this is wild, really
Yeah.
wild. Yeah, didn't see any of that coming, honestly. So like, yeah, very surprising. The critic score, 82%. So generally across the board, people are loving Ben-Hur and Last Temptation of Christ. So if you've made it this far and you're not super into The Passion of the Christ, I'm sorry, The Last Temptation of Christ, people like, then check out maybe Ben-Hur or The Last Temptation of Christ.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't even know if I would recommend Last Temptation of Christ, to be honest.
I don't know who that's
It's a wild
it's
movie.
again, there are only certain people that I would recommend that movie to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like glad I got to experience it because it's kind of one of those movies, and maybe like Scorsese, just like, to be fair, Willem Dafoe, but it's just like it's just so wild. It's just such a weird movie.
It is.
But yeah, well, unfortunately, the victory is going to go to Shaboy Soju, and I'll have to give it a heaven yeet tonight. I have to switch it around for Easter season.
Oh.
Yeah. But okay, well, that was our show for tonight. To wrap us up one more time, thank you again, Nichole, for joining me. Please, one more time, let everyone know where they can find you, listen to your amazing show, contact you if they have more things to discuss. Where can we find you?
So again, the name of the show is Light and Shadow, a horror podcast. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Light and Shadow Pod. You can visit me at lightandshadowpod.com. Just search for me in your favorite podcatcher, and I will probably be there. Let's see, this is coming out in March. So my most recent episode, when you're listening to this episode, will be the Women in Horror episode, and Jacqueline, our friend Jacqueline from A Cut Above, was my guest on that, and we talked about Silent Hill.
Nice.
So check that out. Even though it is March when you're listening to this, you can still celebrate women in horror all year round, so please check it out. And yeah, the Religion and Horror series, I'm planning on just rolling through 2024 with that. So check me out monthly for more religious horror discussion.
Nice on both of those accounts, because actually, funny enough, Women in Horror Month is the first time that we kind of met each other and hung out for back in the day for Straight Chilling, wasn't it? Wasn't that the first episode you were on?
So that was the second episode I was on. The first episode I was on was Don't Breathe.
Oh, okay. Oh, wow. Okay. All right.
Yep.
My bad. Well, anyways, one of the first, but it is always a fantastic episode for Light and Shadow. So, yeah, check that out. And I am excited. I am personally excited about the continuing on with the Religion and Horror year that we're looking forward to. So great. If you are still here, thank you for watching. Hopefully, you're not too mad about what we had to say today for Passion of the Christ. Thank you again for Nichole for joining me for this discussion. It was a lot of fun. And until next time, don't forget to keep chilling.